It's Wednesday, March 19th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 530 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. If you tune into this program regularly, you likely know the format. It's pretty formulaic, but today we're going to do things a little differently. The news out of the region is just pouring in, and it seemed fitting to run this show in the form of a situational report, a SITREP, as the kids say. So let's unpack what's going on right now. After Hamas repeatedly refused to release the remaining hostages, Israel resumed its operations in Gaza. Israel's foreign minister, Gideon Sa'ar, said the decision to strike was made several days ago after Hamas rejected two proposals presented by U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff to extend the ceasefire through Ramadan and then Passover. Within 24 hours of starting back up in Gaza, Israel eliminated 4 senior Hamas officials, or at least that's what they're saying. Hamas's de facto prime minister, the director general of Hamas's justice ministry, director general of Hamas's interior ministry, and the head of Hamas's domestic security agency. Hamas confirmed the deaths of all 4. I'm not sure I would call them all senior officials. I'm not sure anyone's really a senior official anymore in Hamas, at least on the ground there in Gaza. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, over 400 people have been killed since the fighting resumed. I'm not buying those numbers. I don't think anybody should be buying those numbers from the Gaza Health Ministry. That's Hamas. But I do think we should all recognize that this is going to be a grim battle in Gaza where the misery just keeps compounding for the people. Yesterday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that Israel is going to keep fighting to achieve all its objectives, but that doesn't preclude negotiations. If you'll recall, those objectives are returning all the hostages and destroying Hamas. Meanwhile, in Yemen, the U.S. military is striking high-value Houthi targets. That includes military platforms, bases of operations, and much more. On Monday, the director of operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that the Houthis have suffered dozens of military casualties. Thankfully, there's no credible evidence of civilian deaths, just like the Iranian proxy in Gaza. However, the Houthis are claiming otherwise. They say over 50 civilians have been killed, including women and children. Meanwhile, the Houthis have started to retaliate, or at least they're trying. Within a span of 48 hours, the Iran-backed rebels said they attacked the USS Harry S. Truman carrier strike group 3 times. Yesterday, the Houthis announced their 3rd attack on Telegram, which they said involved a salvo of missiles and drones. According to the U.S. defense officials, all 3 Houthi attacks were unsuccessful, some missing by a very wide margin. And Israel's also a target. The IDF shot down a Houthi ballistic missile as it barreled towards Israel. That was the first ballistic missile attack that the Houthis fired at Israel since January. Well, probably. On Sunday, a Houthi missile landed in the Sinai Desert. That may have been intended for Israel as well. Probably was. And Israel reportedly intercepted another ballistic missile overnight. What's striking to me is that the U.S. and Israel are now both in battles against Iranian proxies simultaneously. These two fronts are inextricably connected, and the optics of these two fronts being fought in loose or even close coordination between Israel and the United States is a clear message to the clerical regime in Iran. And as for Iran, President Trump warned the regime that his administration will consider the regime liable for every shot fired by the Houthis. If the Houthis continue with their attacks, Tehran will suffer the consequences, so says Donald Trump. Iran is dishing out some serious bull fertilizer on that front. The regime denied aiding the Houthis and threatened to retaliate with a, quote, devastating response should the U.S. strike Iranian targets. Iran's ambassador to the UN went as far as to warn that the U.S. will face severe consequences if it acts against Tehran. All of that is happening amidst high-level talks between Trump and Putin about a ceasefire in Ukraine. The Israeli people are taking to the streets in protest of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his recent decision to return to Gaza. And Turkey's strongman, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is conducting a crackdown on the opposition in his country and restricting the internet. Full thug mode here. Okay, that's a lot. But let's stick to the Iranian axis, the U.S. and Israel this morning. Lots to unpack. For that, I'm glad to be joined first by FDD's own Jonathan Conricus. He formerly served as the IDF international spokesman And then after that, we're going to have John Hanna, Senior Fellow at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, or JINSA. John is one of the country's top experts on the Middle East. He used to work for a place you might have heard of called FDD. But let's start with welcoming Lieutenant Colonel retired Jonathan Conricus onto the show. Jonathan is a Senior Fellow here at FDD. And as I said, he's a former spokesman of the IDF. He's going to give us some on-the-ground updates right now out of Israel. Welcome to the program, Jonathan Conricus. Oh, you're muted. Let's get you unmuted there.
Yes.
There we go.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be here, Jonathan. Good morning.
Good morning. All right. So let's start with, I think, we can dispute whether these casualties that Hamas has suffered, these reportedly high-level officials, whether they're meaningful or not. I'm not sure they are. But let me ask you big picture. What is Israel's strategy? They're going to get hammered right now for having started the war again. At least that's going to be the narrative coming out of pretty much everywhere. The international community, the UN, the opposition in Israel, the Palestinians, Qatar. I mean, we're seeing it from all over. What is the strategy here from Israel's perspective?
Yeah, so let's begin with actually not with what's going on the ground, but how the world, as you say, it has been responding. And as you say, very predictable responses from Arab countries, European states, and also from the US under President Trump. And what really, really matters for Israel is how the US responds and what kind of prior coordination and green light or approval was given, and what kind of leeway Israel has to defend itself and to actually defeat Hamas in Gaza. And as I understand it, there is significant leeway, and there is what appears to be robust support for Israel to actually go beyond what it has done in the past. Now, what I think Israel is trying to achieve is not yet to go back to war, but it is using, paraphrasing Clausewitz, it is the continuation of policy by other means. So what Israel is trying to do here is to nudge Hamas back to the negotiating table and to impress upon Hamas that if they don't release hostages and if they don't commit to releasing hostages without ending the war, then Israel will go back to the war and will do so with a vengeance, I can say. That, unfortunately, as we speak, and it's afternoon hours in Israel, does not seem to be having the desired effect on Hamas. I do not see them signaling. I do not hear them talking with the negotiators. And I don't think that there is anywhere near enough support on Hamas's most important allies, Egypt and Qatar, for there to be pressure on Hamas or incentive on Hamas to do that thing, which can avert war. Currently, the ball is in Hamas's court, and we'll have to see how they respond. I don't know how long Israel will continue to kind of circle above and wait in a holding pattern. Currently, there is not any intense military operations. There's sporadic strikes based on intel, but at a very low level. And it's basically a holding pattern waiting for Hamas to respond to what Israel is doing. And we have not seen a response yet. I don't know how long Israel will wait. It could be a few days. It could be hours. My guess would be a few days, and then political pressure and patience will run thin, and Israel will have to make a decision, either to fold and go back without any achievement to negotiating with Hamas with a ceasefire without getting hostages back yet, or the other option, which is greatly feared and lots of outcry in the world, but to go back to war, but to do it differently and to inflict pain on Hamas like never before. And I think we are just a few days away from that if Hamas doesn't avert the war.
So let me ask you, Jonathan, because I think that, there are people that are, we saw protests in Jerusalem. You've got the Hostage Family Forum coming out strongly against all of this. And of course, we understand why they're trying to bring back every hostage. And it's incredibly important to many in Israel, if not everyone in Israel, to bring them back. But military pressure hasn't exactly done much to dissuade Hamas from its current course. So what is different right now about what is happening? Why does the Bibi government think that this time around is going to be different, that enough military pressure. I mean, you called them sporadic attacks. I saw something this morning about 80 airstrikes in the span of 10 minutes. I mean, that doesn't seem sporadic. That does seem like a fairly intense bombing raid across the Gaza Strip. But I'm still not convinced that it's going to change anyone's perspective here.
Yeah, no, I'm referring to what's going on now. The 80 or so attacks in 10 minutes was the salvo in which those 4 Hamas seniors or officials were killed, and a few others, and some damage was inflicted on Hamas's infrastructure. That's basically what happened a night and a half ago in Israel. Since then, we haven't had high intensity, and if anybody tells you differently, they are massaging the truth. What's different? Not much yet, and that's why I say that it is merely an effort by Israel to coerce Hamas, or to indicate to Hamas that they need to go back to negotiating and to release hostages. The real, I think, most important critical component that can make a difference is actually the triangle between US, Israel, and Egypt. I think Egypt is the most important country other than Israel and the US, perhaps rivaling those two countries in importance when it comes to the future of Gaza, and when it comes to solving the conflict and this open and infected wound that the Gaza Strip has become under Hamas since they took control in 2007. And so far, it may be that I don't have access to the right information, but so far I don't see enough pressure applied on Egypt for them to understand that what they need to do in order to solve the situation. And pressure on Egypt is then, if it is applied, then that is then translated to pressure on Hamas. And when there's no pressure on Egypt, there is no real world tangible pressure on Hamas, which means that Hamas will continue to play a holding game, and they will wait for international pressure to be brought to bear on Israel, and they will hold out. They will use media and useful idiots around the world in whatever capital of whatever motivation to apply pressure and criticize Israel, and that maybe force Israel to a halt. We will be able to see if Hamas is hurting and under pressure, if they resort back to tactics of psychological warfare with hostages, or if they will actually take action against hostages and release an execution video or other types of psychological warfare. If Hamas does that, I think that will be indicative of the level of pressure that they're under. But I think that, big picture here, moving forward, to me, it's clear that Israel has no options but really to, at some point, go in, continue the fighting with Hamas, and to actually defeat Hamas and get rid of Hamas and make sure that Hamas won't control the Gaza Strip in the future. I think that can only be done by forcing Egypt not to stand in the way of civilians trying to flee a battlefield. I'm not talking about the Egyptians accommodating, and I'm not talking about the Egyptians willingly taking in and helping. I'm just talking about the Egyptians not standing in the way and allowing people to do what people do in conflicts all over the world. Wherever there's war, civilians try to flee and get as far away from danger as they can. Palestinians have been prevented cynically by Hamas and Egypt from doing so, and by other international powerful actors. And that needs to change. If that changes, we can see a solution. We can see a decisive and positive outcome. If it doesn't change, if Egypt isn't incentivized to do so, then it'll be more of the same. My guess, it'll be bloodier, uglier, with even worse visuals than what we've seen before. More international pressure on Israel. But at the end of it, with Hamas still existing in the tunnels underneath Gaza, and they'll be able to emerge afterwards.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you make a compelling case for why Egypt is pivotal on a number of levels here. And I do think that U.S. pressure is going to be important, very important here. as it relates to the Egyptians on a number of fronts. Let me just, I want to broaden out for a second. When we look at the so-called ring of fire strategy that Iran has tried to execute against Israel, when we look out right now, I see Hamas in a severely weakened state. I see Hezbollah in a severely weakened state. I see the Syrian front as having effectively collapsed because of the Assad regime's departure, shall we call it, back in December. The Iraqi front has been very quiet. The Yemeni front seems like it could be heating up. Now, obviously, I think we're seeing some suppressing fire coming from the United States right now. We've seen a couple of missiles fired by the Houthis. How concerned is Israel right now about the resumption of serious salvos of ballistic missiles? There are, of course, a finite number of arrow interceptors. There is the vulnerability. There is no hermetic seal when it comes to missile defense. So how are Israelis, or how is the Israeli defense establishment looking at this right now?
I think your analysis is very accurate, and that is a problem because of the psychological effect that it will have on Israeli civilians when 1.5 million, 2 million Israelis will be forced to wake up in the middle of the night and rush to shelters, as was custom just about 2 months ago. That has a lot of psychological effect. Luckily, not so much of a military effect, but psychology translates into politics, and politics is real-world events. And as such, yes, there is a finite supply of arrows. But during this time, the IDF and Israeli Air Force and air defenses have also developed and been experimenting in other more cost-effective ways to take down incoming threats. The Houthis have been learning a lot, but Israel hasn't been sitting on its hands. And I know of new ways that hopefully will be fielded and will be effective, that will allow Israel more flexibility when it comes to the arsenal of arrow interceptors, which are extremely precious. And Israel, of course, needs to keep them for other long-range threats. I think we would be remiss if we speak about the Houthis and Israel and the US without referencing the very important statement made by the president, where for the first time he draws the direct link between Houthis and Iran. And he says very clearly, we will see an attack by Houthis on American assets as a direct Iranian aggression. And that is something that I think Israel, for reasons not understandable for me, has not said over 15, 20 years. And I think that now is definitely the time to declare and to prop that up with action, that if Iranian proxies attack Israel, Houthis and what's left of them in Iraq, or Hezbollah, or Hamas, then we will see that, Israel will see that as a direct attack by the Islamic Republic of Iran, and we will act and respond accordingly. That needs to be a game changer. And like with so many other things, President Trump is leading the way and really signaling where a very much expanded, shall we say it, field of operations. And I think what Israel should be doing is taking a page out of that book and addressing the Iranian activities in the region in a different way. That, of course, comes back to the amount of interceptors that we have and the ability of the Israeli Air Force to operate, etc., etc. But as you say very correctly, Iran and its axis that they have spent trillions of dollars and tremendous energy in building over the last 20 years, that axis ring of fire around Israel is at, in my mind, its lowest point that it has been in the last 20 years. Momentum is an important thing. And if we, Israel, want to change the trajectory of the Middle East for the better, for more stability, for peace, for prosperity, and for the future of our children, now is the time to change the equations with Iran. And I hope that Israel will do so. And I think we have a great opportunity to do so with the statements made by the US president.
Yeah, and we are hearing people out of Israel talking about changing the map of the Middle East, a very optimistic way of looking at things right now because of the changes that we see. Jonathan Conricus, we're going to let you go. Thank you for joining us this morning on the program.
Thank you.
All right, good stuff. Now it's my pleasure to welcome John Hanna, a senior fellow at GINSA and a former senior official in no less than 3 presidential administrations here in the United States. He's going to analyze regional realities from an American foreign policy perspective. So let's welcome him onto the program now. Welcome to the FDD Morning Brief, John Hanna.
Hi, John. Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. All right, so let's start to unpack things from a U.S. perspective. We just heard Jonathan Conricus talk about how things look from Israel's perspective. Try to explain to me what's going on here within the Trump administration. We got Witkoff out in Qatar trying to negotiate some kind of hostage deal. You got a green light given from the president to the Israelis to hammer Hamas while we try to get Hamas to get to yes about additional hostage releases. Meanwhile, hammering the Houthis, meanwhile, threatening the Iranians that if they direct the Houthis to carry out these attacks. I mean, are we watching an end game of sorts? Is the Trump administration trying to bring all of this to a neat and packaged ending? How do you assess what's going on?
Well, I'd like to certainly believe that's the case, Jonathan. I don't think you ever know for sure whether you can attribute the president to playing this kind of three-dimensional chess or whether he just saw a threat to the United States Navy, an embarrassment to the Americans. We've been going after the Houthis now for more than a year to very little effect, and he just decided enough was enough, and he's going to go after and take care of this problem. But I would like to believe that this is now a concerted U.S.-Israeli strategy together to militarily degrade and destroy all of the Iranian axis of resistance in order to clear the path for the ultimate prize, which is a joint U.S.-Israeli effort to either force Iran to give up that nuclear program, to dismantle it in a kind of Libya-like negotiation and ultimatum, or they're going to take kinetic action to take down and end that program once and for all. So I'd like to believe that the path to Tehran and that nuclear program goes through Sana'a. I'm a little bit worried that with the resumption of a difficult insurgency type war in Gaza to finish up Hamas and an American effort in Yemen against, where militaries, it's a military graveyard for outsiders, Yemen. It very rarely offers any kind of real benefit to people that take on the difficulties and the extremism of Yemen. I worry that we could be getting into situations here where we begin diverting our energies and taking our eyes off the ultimate prize, which is to take care of the head of the snake, the Iran and the Iranian nuclear program, at which point all of these other secondary challenges in the Middle East, all of Iran's tentacles, once the head of the snake is chopped off, become much easier to deal with. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Fully agree. And I do think that that's where everyone's attention at some point is going to have to be directed. But let me ask you something that's just been on my mind over the last couple of days. And I think you're the guy to ask. You've got the perspective, having worked for multiple administrations. Have you ever seen this before, where the U.S. is striking one proxy, Israel is striking another? And by the way, the proxy that the U.S. is striking is attacking Israel. You've got the common enemy of Iran backing both of these actors. This looks like offensive coordination. We've seen defensive coordination and diplomatic coordination before. I mean, but even activating the CENTCOM missile defenses during the 2 previous onslaughts of Iranian ballistic missiles and drones back in April and November of last year, right? The defensive coordination's always been strong. The diplomatic coordination's always been strong. Right now, it looks like you've got 2 separate offenses against a common front. Is that new in your eyes?
Yeah, I can't recall another time. I mean, Israel has obviously been battling Iranian proxies for most of the last 17 months. The United States hasn't really gotten into this game in a serious way almost ever, except its work against the Iraqi militias, but for a very specific purpose to protect our forces in Iraq. So this is definitely something new, with American and Israeli forces in combat at the same time against two key elements of this Iranian axis. It's new. You hope it's well coordinated, and you hope it's part of a broader strategy that ultimately, as you say, takes us some time over the coming months directly to the main problem in the region, which is Iran and that nuclear program in particular.
All right, so let's get to the head of the snake, as you call it, the head of the octopus, the brain behind all of this. The regime is weak, right? We know this. The Israelis have taken out the vast majority, if not all, of those S-300 strategic air defense systems, and it does not look like they're going to be able to be replenished anytime soon. We call this right now a window of weakness for the regime. So what are you looking at right now as you watch the words of Donald Trump, you watch the words of Bibi Netanyahu, you look at the actions of these two leaders, and maybe, I guess, the atmospherics around the world right now? Everyone knows that this is a real possibility, that you could see a strike against the Iranian nuclear program. You could see strikes against other assets of the Iranian regime. How do we unpack what's going on here? What's the likelihood of escalation on that front?
Frankly, my own personal view is very high, Jonathan. I mean, as you say, we are now in this window where, on the one hand, Iran's nuclear program and assets have never been more vulnerable because of what the Israelis have done over the past 6 or 7 months. On the other hand, they've also, as we know, never been closer to actually achieving a military nuclear capability. So we have this short window, perhaps, where we can take dramatic action, if not to demolish this program, then to set it back for years to come. The president did, until the last few days, perhaps seem very committed to trying to negotiate with Iran. I think it's a long shot, not only because we've had 2 or 3 decades of absolute failure to negotiate an end to Iran's nuclear ambitions, but because the time frame is now so short. With snapback coming up in October, we've got to negotiate a very complex disarmament of Iran's nuclear ambitions within the space of only a few months. I think it's terribly unrealistic. So I think the prospect of Israel feeling that 80 years after the Holocaust, with this kind of opportunity, a prime minister of Israel has got to take perhaps what will be our last best shot to really set back and degrade this Iranian nuclear program. And then the question is, how does the United States come in behind to support that effort? Does it actually join the attack with Israel, which would obviously lead to the maximum outcome for the United States, Israel, and the world? Or does it hang back and support in one form or another, containing any kind of Iranian retaliation, protecting Israel, our Gulf allies, the world's oil supplies? All that remains to be determined, but you just hope that the United States and Israel, even as they deal with these secondary challenges out of Yemen, out of Gaza, are in intense coordination at every single level of national power to figure out how they're going to put an end to Iran's decades-long march toward a nuclear bomb sometime over the next 6 months.
Yeah, and that's what they're saying, 6 months. That's the window. Maybe it's 7, maybe it's 8, but we're looking at about a half year with that window being open. I got one more question before we let you go, John. You and I, over the years, we've talked about the futility of putting American assets and diverting American attention toward what we typically call the two-state solution. This, the futility of the ongoing diplomatic efforts to get the Israelis and Palestinians to somehow lay down their arms and give up and work together. And that would, of course, include the Israelis giving up Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, which I think right now just does not seem like something that this current government is willing to do. And I think even if there was a change in government, I think there are very few in Israel that would be able to run on a platform of saying, yeah, let's leave Judea and Samaria right now, given all the threats that we're watching. But yet, something else that's near and dear to your heart and mind, the idea of trying to secure additional Abraham Accords agreements, particularly with Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis giving voice right now to what I think we hear across the Arab world, that Israel needs to get out of the West Bank. They need to acknowledge a Palestinian state. They need to allow for statehood to flourish in the West Bank or beyond. How would you navigate this right now? You've been in the ear of presidents and vice presidents and secretary of states in the past. What would you say to a senior American official who's saying, look, we need to go back to the two-state solution in order to get a deal done with Saudi Arabia? How would you navigate that?
Well, I remain as pessimistic as I've always been about any prospect anytime soon for actually resolving that conflict, principally because of the various pathologies we see in the Palestinian leadership, both in Hamas and the PA, but broader in Palestinian society. There's obviously a serious cultural, sociological problem that's going to take a long time to resolve and get them to accommodate themselves to a Jewish state next door that lives in full peace and security. But unfortunately, because of October 7th, one thing Hamas succeeded in was putting this Palestinian back on the Saudi agenda in a way that it obviously wasn't before October the 7th. It was clear to me from discussions with the Saudi leadership that they were perfectly prepared now to de-link any kind of resolution of the Palestinian issue, which they still supported, from their ability to pursue their national interests, to have a much dramatically improved relationship with America, and to qualitatively have a serious relationship with Israel, the region's most powerful military and dynamic, innovative economy. October the 7th set that back. I think it's a speed bump. I think we've got to find a way, if we can, to kind of, park or calm down and de-escalate in Gaza, to deal with the Iranian problem, which the Saudis share with Israel and the United States as the number one threat to the region. Come up with some kind of formula. I propose going back to the Trump 2020 peace plan, putting that forward again as a possibility that holds out the prospect somewhere in a galaxy far, far away of a Palestinian state at the end of the road, but something that allows the Saudis to climb down out of the tree that October the 7th put them in, and to go back to the main agenda, at least for the United States, I think, which is normalization, a new regional security architecture that puts our strongest, most capable, most influential allies in Israel and the Arab world together, and taking down the threat of Iran and that Iranian nuclear program. And then, like I said, I do think everything else won't become doable, but it'll just become much more manageable for American and Israeli national interests. And we can deal with the secondary problems to Iran and this new regional architecture that I think can transform the region in ways that are absolutely essential to American national interests and our ability to deal with all the global challenges that we face, be it in Europe or East Asia.
And there are many. All right, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you, John Hanna, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Great to be back with you, Jonathan. Thank you.
All right, those are two top experts giving us a little bit of a take on what's happening in Israel, what's happening in the U.S., and how we're viewing it from both of those vantage points. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. FDD Chief Executive Mark Dubowitz's brand new podcast, The Iran Breakdown, launches today. I'm not going to give you any spoilers, but 3 episodes are dropping, with the first featuring the Crown Prince of Iran himself. I highly recommend checking it out wherever you get your podcasts. Also, be sure to read my colleague Jonathan Saya's piece in FDD's Long War Journal, which details the Iranian regime's ties to organized crime networks in the West, including Sweden's Foxtrot gang, recently sanctioned by the United States Treasury. Iran's insidious influence extends far beyond the Middle East, posing a dire threat to global security. Finally, my colleagues Ord Kitri, Andrea Stricker, and Behnam Ben Talablu have released a new excellent monograph outlining a strategy to dismantle the threat of a nuclear Iran for good. You can find it on FDD's website. It's titled Iran's Nuclear Dismantlement, worth a read, every word of it. That's going to do it for today's special SITREP episode of the FDD Morning Brief. I hope you enjoyed this slightly different format. I believe we're going to be going back to the old format on Friday. If you're feeling the need for more knowledge, please do read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD, and definitely check out, if you want to doom scroll on Instagram or YouTube, you've got it from us. And please get on board and support our mission with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. We are deeply, deeply thankful to all of our donors for helping to make this work possible. We cannot produce this program, the FDD Morning Brief, or any of our other podcasts, research products, written products without you. So please join the team. Tune in Friday for another gripping episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Hope to see you then. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for this special episode of the FDD Morning Brief.